This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 366, December the 8th, 1978, and this is side one. And we'll be talking part two. This is part two of the series on the People's Temple. For those of you that have a dialogue conspiracy, number 282, that goes back to August the 15th, 1977, that was a year and a half ago. I did a tape on mind control. This is part one of Son of Sam. And by way of introduction, I explained how the United States government not only tested for 25 years, spending $25 million, the use of the mind and behavior modification. At least that's the amount the CIA spent. That doesn't include Navy intelligence, Army intelligence, National Institute of Mental Health, and so forth. But this is money that was spent for changing behavior, and it was called tests. But the tests stopped, and then the application begins. After 25 years of testing, then the application begins on these programs. And that's an important part of understanding this problem of mind control and the use of manipulating people. Once you discover the formula for Coca-Cola or aspirin, you stop putting it together, and then you begin applying it. And that was the purpose of the test, was to find methods of operation that would be useful in the future for political purposes. And I talked about the mind test preceding the explanations about who David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, was. And I quoted from my very first article that I ever published on the American assassins, the way that they're under mind control and are given a zombie appearance. And this was particularly true of Jack Ruby, whose memory was erased, and Sirhan. Not very many people have seen Arthur Bremer at all to see his state of mind, but he obviously was under some kind of control from the time he shot George Wallace. He had that silly grin, and he hasn't even screamed or asked for a new trial, even though there were multiple bullets in Laurel, Maryland, and he couldn't have been the only assassin. He doesn't seem to be kicking up much storm, and nobody's there defending his interests yet. But the type of American assassin that I was talking about fits the description of Dan White, the man who is now in jail, who's killed Mayor George Moscone in San Francisco. And he told his wife he thought he did something. He met her right afterwards in a church, that something went wrong. And when he was told that Harvey Milk was dead and George Moscone were dead, he said, "Oh, that's too bad." And he, obviously from the interviews about him, and very, very few people can get to see him. He's isolated. And I described in my first published article, our American assassins are hired as decoys. They're either killed or isolated in their cages, and they're separated from every other person in the prison. And that's true of Dan White right now in San Francisco. But in case any of you don't have that tape and can't afford to get it or can't get it at this time, that's tape number 282. I said there's a minister in California who is skilled, has moved down to Guyana. He has $1 million missionary. His name is Jim Jones. He's tied to a lot of politicians in California. He's a father of thousands of people in the church. He calls himself their father. He has acquired at least 25 pieces of property in Ukiah, California, and in Mendocino. He has more than $500,000 in California and $1 million in Guyana. Now that million in Guyana from 1977 to 1978 has grown to 13 million, 7 to 10 million in Swiss banks, in Zurich and in Panama and in other countries, and $3 million in cash down there, in addition to $500,000 of diamonds and gold. I underestimated it quite a bit. I said those of you who heard my dialogue conspiracy the week before, that was number 281, I had talked about right-wing churches funding missionaries, that the church was a front for missionaries. See, this is a wonderful way to have assassination teams, because the FBI and the Justice Department can come in and say, you have the right to your own religion, we can't investigate. I talked about that school for assassins in Mexico that I referred to many times, and believed that once the cover was blown in 1970 in Oaxaca, Mexico, that the School for Assassins could be moved down to Guyana, and this would be what Jim Jones was operating. I wrote these notes for that particular tape. I'm referring to them again, and you can hear the tape. This news this week, December the 5th, an article that Jim Jones ran a school for assassins that had been brainwashed and programmed under a mind control program, and this was a school for assassins. A year and a half later, it's in the news. I said the reason Jim Jones is acting as a minister is that he can get people to sign confessions for him, and they did sign blank pieces of paper. They signed confessions to crime, various members of the church, and they could be used in any way they wanted. These confessions included molesting their own children, and they signed confessions that they would conspire to kill the president or overthrow the government. Now that's very nice, because then as soon as these people are dead, there's notes such as the one pinned on Jim Jones talking about communism, or his aide, this Marie Casares, the white Russian father member of the Greek Orthodox Church. She's the one who gave $500,000 in gold and diamonds or whatever money to two men who were fleeing. Mark Lane saw them going down the road with his footlocker, out of which he'll get his salary later, or he's getting it at the present time. And the message was given to the Russian embassy. The people that are dead, or the outside people, make the grand claims that Jim Jones was a Marxist and wanted to give it to the Russians. The Russians are not involved in national narcotics traffics, international, such as the intelligence communities and organized crime, and they wouldn't even touch Jim Jones. He wanted to give them money. The politicians, the Democratic Party, all accepted his votes and his money. The Russians said, give it to the United Nations, and they didn't even want his money, and he hadn't been to Cuba with these people, and the goal was allegedly that he wanted to move them to Soviet Union. I'm sure they wouldn't let him in any more than they let Lee Harvey Oswald into Cuba, knowing who he was. I talked about on that tape in August of 77 that this camp was like a Nazi Germany concentration camp, that families had to accuse other members of their family of doing crimes, and when they were being hit with boards and fists and so forth, they would yell, hit them harder. I said that Jim Jones uses deprivation, humiliation, poverty, and pain. That is what I said in August of 77. And that people there have to stay. They can't leave. December the 5th, 1978, there were articles in the newspaper again saying that Jim Jones said, once I get them there, there is no way to get out. And that was absolutely true. I think only several were able to escape, and tried to expose what was going on. One was Debbie Layton Blakey, and she's one of the people that had informed the State Department and the FBI and journalists very clearly of what was going on down there. Well, some of you have that tape, so I won't go into it any further, but that's the Jim Jones I was talking about. It's interesting that Mae Brussell, sitting here in Carmel, California, can make these connections of programming people and having assassination teams and having this unlimited money that obviously can get through the IRS. But the government officials can't understand what's going on down there. Just a woman sitting in Carmel Valley can figure this thing out, but all the powers that be can't protect those 1,200 people that were down there, or the 910 that were slain, and then the coterie of the guards around them. Before I go into the outline of Jim Jones, I just want to make comments about several things that are in the news this week. One is that another Roman Catholic archbishop died. He's from Hanoi, Trinh New Hugh. He was at the conclave in August of 1978, and in October 1978 he helped elect John Paul I and John Paul II, and there was an announcement by the Vatican that he died following a brief illness. That is the sixth, I believe, of the high officials, including John Paul I, that have died within a 6-month period. There seems to be an epidemic of these high religious leaders of the Catholic Church. Granted, he wasn't young, he was 79 years old, but it was a brief illness, and people very close to the Vatican seem to be going. So we'll just think about it and see how many more there are in the near future. Representative Steiger died this last week, announced December the 5th. He was a GOP activist. He was active in the Young Republicans Party and got a lot of state and local and civic awards, but he was considered an expert on House rules, and he worked on the Rules Committee in 1976. At the GOP National Convention, he's the person who led the forces of President Ford, who tried to head off any attempt to permit the Ford delegates to vote instead for California Governor Ronald Reagan. Now that's important, very important, because I have said since 1972 that Reagan was really meant to front for the Stanford, what he would call his kitchen cabinet, would be the Stanford czars, white Russians, the most extreme fanatical political right. And Reagan is getting too old to be president after the next election. And it's very important that the surviving Republicans be staunch Reaganites and be in his camp. So therefore, that any deaths or voting records of any people in Congress that would oppose him, I mentioned before the the race in Virginia, where Mr. Warner won, Secretary of the Navy, a staunch Reagan man, is now in the Senate from Virginia after a very close count of votes in the last election, and after the opponent who beat him in the primary was killed in a plane crash. So whenever you see the death or near death of a congressman, it's as important to watch the Republican deaths as it is the Democratic deaths, particularly the Republican deaths. There's a near death of Senator Ted Stevens up in Alaska, in Anchorage, Alaska. His wife was killed and 4 other people were killed, and as of today, when I'm making the tape, he's still alive in critical condition. But there's also a lot of politics, as you know, going on in Alaska. Long article in the Washington Post just this week on Alaska shipping the oil to the Midwest oil pipelines as planned. Whether we'll be able to use it on the western coast or whether it's going to the Midwest, the routes of the oil are being decided now, and there are a lot of contenders there on how this oil is going to be shipped out or where it's going to go. And the contenders, of course, include Standard Oil in Ohio and the Alaskan oil going to Long Beach, California, or to Midland, Texas. There is now an oil glut, even though our prices of oil and gasoline are going to go up. And there's a decision that hasn't quite been finalized on the routes of the oil, and this may be a factor in the near death of Senator Ted Stevens. All of these plane crashes just may be coincidences, but some of these people are making major decisions that would make a difference of millions or billions of dollars to particular corporations as against another corporation. Therefore, you have to always consider that possibility and follow the information. An article in the San Francisco Chronicle, December the 5th, 1978, the money for People's Temple, the special money outside of the $3 million that's in Jonestown, in quotes, was never People's Temple money. It was money that Jim Jones secured in one way or another. Now that either is from the Hughes Institute to affect our elections, to make assassination teams, to make sure that Reagan and company get in the next election, because I think one political assassination of a president is worth about $10 million. That's what it was worth at Watergate to try and kill Richard Nixon and make Spiro Agnew president. This money comes from another source. Now, it only comes from international narcotics, or it comes from the intelligence, defense agencies, and the intelligence agencies and the FBI for the political assassinations, or it comes from health, education, welfare, and National Institute of Mental Health and the Division of Mental Health because of the payment for doing the mind control experiments. But actually, this large sum of money in Zurich and Panama has to be those assassination teams, and then these poor people were just set up to sign the confession slips and be the patsies. I would wonder about the $500,000 in gold and diamonds. It would be interesting for each person that died down there to interview the immediate family and see what family jewels were missing, because I read one article that even suggested that they took the gold from the people, and I wonder if one reason we couldn't see the bodies and they're going to cremate them and destroy them is that, identical to Nazi Germany, they could be even removing the gold from the teeth of these people and taking it from them. They had $500,000 worth of gold and diamonds. It's hard to believe that the people who went down to Guyana took that kind of jewelry with them, or even had it. I doubt if they even had it. I think some of this cash was being melted in or turned into gold and diamonds so that they could then take it to international markets, in addition to the $100 of American bills that was put in stockpiles and filing cabinets, $3 million in $100 bills. I'm very anxious to go into detail on the use of Mark Lane in all of this, where he fits in, and also the murder of George Moscone in San Francisco. But before I do that, I promised last week that I would give you the working outline that I'm doing on this Guyana story, because it is so big and it's so fresh. I made this outline last week, and I think I'm going to go over that with you now, so that each week as we talk about Guyana, we won't be doing it every single week, but I will be referring to it from time to time. I'm going to give you my file outline on a specific case as it's coming down, because while I've referred to much of my research in the past, then you can follow my train of thinking, because the purpose, of course, with many young people is to teach them how to solve these crimes in the future or in the present, or to look back at the past. So this is the way I've broken down my outline, which I've enclosed for you this week, the sheet, and then you can do your own work and maybe find some old envelopes or folders, make folders out of cardboard or whatever, and keep some articles or information as you see it from the articles in these outlines. I've divided the general subject of Jim Jones so far into 7 Roman numerals, and of course it's always open. It may end up that I'll have 40 sections before I'm through, 40 different Roman numerals, but basically I've opened it up to 7 sections, and in there I can add more. Right now I have 69 different manila envelopes, but it will go up, say, to 120, and if it fits into a section where 48 is, I can call it 48A, 48B, and slip the information into those sections. But section 1 in here is motives and what went wrong. Now in there, the first envelope, I keep the chronology of dates of Jim Jones' life, when Leo Ryan went down, information on the People's Temple, every date that is pertinent to this event. Even Harvey Milk was fired. He resigned, rather, from the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, November the 10th. I put that there, and then I put down the date that Congressman Ryan was down there, and the day that Jim Jones moved from Ukiah down to Brazil, the date he moved from, not Ukiah, from Indiana, the dates he was in Bloomington, Indiana, because I've mentioned that city is an important place because of Tom Charles Houston and Emily and William Harris from the SLA story, and Angela and Gary Atwood and other people, some of the hit team from Indiana. The dates that are involved, an overlay of the dates of the movement of the UCLA school, when it was started, when it was conceived, when it was stopped, when he moved down there and got his compound, and so forth. That is one file on chronology. The next is the purpose of Guyana location. I put a question mark there, but in my own mind, I'm asking, was it a center for mind control, and was it a center for assassination teams? Now, that was what I thought was the motive of the Guyana compound as of last week, just before I had done this tape. I think it was last Thursday, and within this 1 week, there have been articles that there were assassination teams that were set up there, and that they were under the mind control, that they have been treated as assassins and treated with mind control projects as assassins. And the information that comes out that confirms what I thought was the original purpose of this People's Temple down there, or even from the very beginning, gets filed into section number 2 under section A, evidence of this. 3 is what went wrong, why the mass deaths necessary. Now, in that section are the ideas that I've shared with you, that they, in case they discovered what was going on, they would have to kill everybody there. That nobody would be able to know if there were intentions to do electrodes or electroshock or records kept of deprivation and so forth. If somebody was going to come down and intrude, what would the contingency be? What if they had the Nike base in California, or somebody could break into a Tuscadero or certain parts of Vacaville prison right now? where they're currently still using what they tested up to 1967, what would they have to do to conceal? They must have a contingency plan. And that is the Section 1, Number 4 is the contingency, was made at least a year in advance. Of course, from the moment they broke ground, when he opened up his place in Ukiah, there was a guard and police dogs and a tower and fences. You can see pictures of it. An armed compound. Now, how does that differ from, say, Albert Schweitzer's clinic in Africa, medical clinic, that Mark Lane compares this to? Well, all you have to do is drive up to Albert Schweitzer's clinic and say, hello, I came to see your clinic, and he says, come right in. Nobody was kept there under armed guards. Nobody was locked up. There were no police dogs, and there were no prisoners. They came for medical care, period. He was helping the poor, and that's what he was there for. And he had a reputation for helping the sick and the poor, and there's no comparison to this. Albert Schweitzer was an organist and a physician and gave concerts in Europe and down there, organ recitals, and there was no mass punishment and no standing in front of microphones so that everyone could hear you screaming, and there were no people getting up on the stage and having their penis banged with a big bat in front of people because of some sexual problem or belief of a deviation in front of the whole group. There was no humiliation or pain, and it was an open place. And that's the difference between Mark Lane's comparing Albert Schweitzer's clinic to this. So the contingency was made down there. In the particular case that anyone arrived, not only did they have the dogs, the guards, the isolation, the airport, the boat harbor tied up, but they had to have the suicide plans. The contingency was to destroy all evidence except a few notes linking them to Russia and socialism and communism. Destroy everything else, destroy all the people. That was the contingency plan made at least a year ago when he moved from San Francisco down there. And then under cast of characters, that may go right now, it may go from 20 to 200 people, personalities of Mr. and Mrs. Stone and Jim Jones and Mark Lane and the Katsara's woman, everyone who's important to the story. Collect as many pieces of the biography, how many worked in mental hospitals, how many handled the mentally sick, the nurses, how many doctors' names come up. Undercast of characters may have its own division, as I say, up to 40 or 80 people that are important to this story. Section 2, contingency plans, made all along. This had nothing to do with Jim Jones' son. That's the cover story under the Section 1. But Section 2 is the actual planning of the operation in case the invasion took place, the news media or a member of Congress or law enforcement or the military came in. Now, the excuse for triggering all this off was that Mr. and Mrs. Stone wanted their son, that Jim Jones was supposed to be the father of this little boy, and they wanted him back. And Jim Jones had said, if you come and take this son, this little boy of mine, then everybody here has to die. 1,200 people have to die if you take him. Well, Congressman Ryan went down there. He went with the news media. He stayed overnight one night. He was leaving the next afternoon. The son didn't want to go with him. There was no son on the plane with him. And yet the contingency was to die, and Mark Lane has admitted, and Charles Gary knew, that the plans were to kill all of these people. They knew that in advance, that this was the intention of Jim Jones, and it had nothing to do with the boy. The boy died down there, but he didn't die at the airport. He didn't leave, and he had no desire to leave. At least he didn't express it. So that is only a cover. So the contingency plans had been made, and then under Roman numeral 6, I have why this suicide plans, and of course we know in the CIA that Candy Jones was told to commit suicide, and she was going down and dive into a bed of rocks with shallow water. It was only her husband, her new husband, that saved her. He's now dead of cancer, Long John Neville, but he was able to save her, and the intent here was to murder. Jim Jones, according to Time Newsweek, he was found dead, didn't commit suicide. He was shot in the head, but the gun was never found if he commits suicide. The gun wasn't on the ground. The gun was never found. And we don't know how many people had gunshots in their head. Mark Lane said he heard 80 rounds, and Charles Gary said 3, and they were standing in the same place. But people had to line up and take the poison, and we don't know how many were dead because the Army, the United States Army, the Defense Department, refuses to do an autopsy to tell us out of 910 people if the others were shot in the head or in the stomach or what. We know how they were lined up in the concentration camps in Germany to die, but being as these people are lying on their stomach face down, it's hard to tell exactly. And because they're not having autopsies and because they waited 4 days to come in, all part of the contingency plan, we don't know how they died. But the books are coming out calling this strange cult of death. So we have the United States government studying suicide at UCLA, that school I referred to last week, and I'll constantly be referring to, that I believe could be transferred to a place like Guyana. Then under 7, murder. How many were murdered? How many were forced to die? Who was found shot? They've admitted that 2 people were found dead, and they refused to do the autopsies. But what evidence? We know that they were forced to line up and take their poison or they would be shot. And then who lived? And then under this section is try to find as many names of the coterie around the black people, the 910 people who died. We call this the murder plot. How many were children? And we have to get some hard statistics in the months and years to come, because I don't know what age you call suicide. Is a 10-year-old a suicide, or a 7-year-old, or a 6-year-old? Or if a mother picks up a newborn baby and pours this in their mouth, is that called suicide? And if these people were part of the murder and then run away with the money and go down the alley, and just take the money and leave the wife and baby to die, that must be murder. If you could grab a kid and save your kid and leave the money, that's a different circumstance. In this case, they left the kid and grabbed the money and went down the road. And then the drugs used for the suicide and murder. This is different than the drugs in the clinic or the narcotics, the chance that they were in an international drug running, or even with rifles, weapons, drug running in exchange for money and so forth. This is the drugs used on the compound. For example, I've filed in here where Mark Lane said he knew in advance that this could be coming down, that they would be drugged at lunch. So he took his own cough drops with sugar and picked up some supplies, I guess, at the Kennedy Airport in New York, going down to Georgetown, so that he wouldn't have to eat the food that the congressman ate, knowing that they were going to be drugs. That contingency plan includes the cyanide and the chloral hydrate, and the guns go under the murder, and that is the contingency section 2. Roman numeral 3 is Jim Jones. That's on Jones himself, his links and involvement with the U.S. government, the CIA, federal connections, and state connections. And under there, the psychological profile of Jim Jones, which is always the cover story, the media hype, which I wrote in that article, American Assassins, the one I did for The Realist, singling him out. His father was gassed during World War I. His mother worked 16 miles away in a factory. His loneliness as a child, his giving his little eulogies for animals that died, etc., etc., etc. It goes on and on. This is the usual story. It never explains how he ends up being photographed with the wife of the President of the United States or running the Housing Commission in San Francisco and the high places that he took, considering that he was being injected and followed with a nurse constantly and was under the control of the same people himself as the people he was shipping down there. Then finances is always the modus operandi. That's the important thing, is how much money he had to buy property, how much money he had to buy the synagogues. He bought 2 synagogues, which is interesting, one in Indiana and one in San Francisco, for the location of his People's Temple, took over from a Jewish synagogue. Really a desecration. And again, it smacks of a certain Nazism. The whole operation was a Nazi operation, but they chose to go into the synagogues and turn them around. The finances, then Brazil. We talk about the boys from Brazil. This is the boys from Guyana. What did he do in Brazil, 1961 and 62? his relationships to the U.S. Embassy, his trips to Argentina, what was his modus operandi, how did he get down there, who hired him in Brazil. Those questions are important. Where did he work in Brazil that he came back with $100,000 to put in the bank to open up the People's Temple in Ukiah? The next move was to Ukiah, California, with that $100,000 and the fence compound. Information about that. We'll continue with this on the second side of the tape about Ukiah on out down to Guyana. In 1972, we had Watergate. Now we have Koreagate. This is side 2 of tape 366B, December the 8th, 1978. You see how important it is to date these tapes because I can refer back to that tape August of 1977 and say a year and a half ago that I was talking about this Jim Jones and mind control and the School for Assassins, and we can date back how far back this information was available if the federal government wanted to use it. Now back to our outline of Jim Jones. From Ukiah, he moved to San Francisco, they say, the People's Temple, the synagogue on Geary Street. Of course, the finances there, it would be interesting to study the purchase, how he used the money. Also up in Ukiah, how he got the license to take care of the people up there. Just last week, the state of California withdrew his license to have a care center for aged and disabled up in Ukiah because Jim Jones is dead and because of the scandals. And it turned out that the couple that are managing his property are off in Haiti right now. They're not even there. He had a place called Happy Acres, which was for mentally disturbed people that were given to him without any license or ability to take care of these people. The state was paying the money, and the people were delivered to Jim Jones and enclosed in this compound up in Ukiah. Then Jim went down and opened a temple in Los Angeles, which is important because the criminal conspiracy section of Los Angeles Police Department worked closely with Jolly West at UCLA and had law enforcement officer Mr. Fisk, I mentioned last week on the tape there. So the Los Angeles connections, if they come in, are important. He was once arrested, I believe, on a pornography charge, not pornography, but for soliciting sex, I think, with an agent, and was released and let off the hook. All of his Los Angeles activities goes under Roman numeral 3, there, the section 15. Then the Jim Jones with the federal agencies, Jim Jones with the FBI, connections and protection. That is, whenever somebody went to the FBI and complained, they protected him or wouldn't investigate him or their records cleared him. Jim Jones with the CIA, his connections and protections. With health, education, welfare, the juveniles that were in his care. They went to the Opportunity School up in Oakland, and they don't have the list of who the children were, or if they're dead now. We don't know how many of those are dead that were the juveniles sent from the state of California. His connections with LEAA, the law enforcement agencies, and the federal law enforcement connections. State Department favors for Jim Jones, San Francisco Police, People's Temple, weapons, hitmen, and training. For example, 4 men that were hitmen down in Guyana were trained by the San Francisco Police Department. The story is that they will train any people that come in, and there's openings for them. But it's interesting that a man from the San Francisco Police Department killed Mayor George Moscone, who had done a lot of favors for Jim Jones. They both helped each other. And coming from the police department and the mysterious zombie-like appearance of the assassin of the mayor and Harvey Milk makes it imperative to look in, particularly with Charles Gaines as chief of police there, because as I've said many, many times, he is the man who was orchestrating the Zebra murders and the Zodiac affair up there through his office, the protection of that, and the SLA. The Los Angeles police connections are also important because of not only his People's Temple being there, and his arrest, but that Lewis Tackwood allegations of the criminal conspiracy section going from Los Angeles up through the state of California, and links with the plans of the UCLA school to test minorities and poor, the black, the drug, the Indians, the children, the women particularly. The LAPD had a direct role and interest in these operations, and if Jim Jones had connections with the Los Angeles police, it goes into Roman numeral 3, number 22. Then his political contacts. Now, under number 23 of your list here, the political contacts, I'll break that down again into various people from the California Assembly, and Lieutenant Governor Mervyn Dimely from California, and members of Congress and San Francisco politicians, Board of Supervisors, the mayor, specifically the milieu of the cities where he lived, the political contacts from the local area to the national level, because Hubert Humphrey was a man who was receiving money from the Howard Hughes organization. He had received anywhere up to $50,000 to $500,000 in money from Howard Hughes. Mayor George Moscone was, at the time his death, was being investigated, getting money from Howard Hughes, and that Hughes money has been used for assassination teams in the past. It's an umbrella that also can silence the potential investigators, the people that would look into it later, or it could be siphoned again down to a place where he accumulated this mass amount of millions and millions of dollars, which was extra than what the people earned or inherited or from the property they sold. This money came from something much bigger, like the Defense Intelligence Agencies, Defense Industry Security Command, and the politicians have a big role. If they're not part of the crime, they're always part of the cover-up. And whether they cover up because of blackmail or payoffs, I don't know. Jim Jones offered a large amount of money to Congressman Leo Ryan not to come down to Guyana. He refused the money and went to Guyana. But were there 2 or 3 other congressmen that were asked to go there who took the money instead, who stayed alive and pocketed the money? You see, we don't know. The other congressmen were asked to look into this, and they turned their backs and said no. Did they turn their backs because their debts for the last election were paid? Those are things we don't know. If Congressman Ryan just ran an election and just won, if he were heavily in debt, would he have taken the money and stayed in Washington? It was offered to him. He didn't take it. But there were other congressmen that were asked to get into this, and they turned it down. So these are political contacts. And then this section 24 is Mayor George Moscone himself in San Francisco, because he's the one who gave credibility to Jim Jones. His election was based on a very narrow margin, and he was supposed to be very grateful to Jim Jones for bringing in those extra votes. And Jones was put on the San Francisco Housing Authority. A real fanatic, heavily drugged, crazy, sadistic, a Nazi, humiliating black people, pulling tricks, pulling livers out of a toilet and telling them he cured their cancer. Literally mass hypnosis of a bunch of people, except the ones that weren't so hypnotized was the white guard. That was white knight was his keyword to start killing those masses of black people. But the white guard around him are still alive, and he was pretty smart about that. They're still, the one that ran the show before are still out loose running it now, it seems. I put down the White House here, President Mrs. Carter and Jim Jones. Not only was he photographed shaking hands with Rosalind Carter, he had corresponded a few form letters, it's true, but the very fact that the White House has protected this whole operation and passed it off as if it was just a fart in the wind is important. And I have the presidential press conferences and what he says about this matter, what he does, and we put that under President of the United States in Jim Jones. And then the federal communications role, his radio tower, what he did with it, who received information in Tennessee, also in Houston, Texas. There was a radio connection there, people that were involved with the radio tower down to Tennessee and to Houston, Texas. And that goes under the radio tower and the federal communication system. Then the internal revenue, the favoritism, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, the drug traffic, the weapon traffic, the open harbor, the IRS, never picking up this accumulation of all these millions of dollars, and then the organized crime connections of People's Temple and the people around him, Jim Jones, and so forth. Now, under Section 3, I have up to number 31, but as I say, I can add A or B or add more files as I need them, but right now, these sections are being filled up with information from the tapes that I've taken off the air in the last 3 weeks, and also the massive amount of articles and the 2 books that are already out. Now, Section 4, Roman numeral 4, has to do with the mind control experiments in the school for assassins. Under Section 1 is my analysis of what the motive was and the contingency. If my motive is right, then that contingency had to go into operation. And Section 4, going down there, you see the numbers on the list, you can follow it, are the pieces of information that I have already, and I'll be filling in these envelopes, any more information that comes out on these subjects, because there already is enough of these to break them out in this category. One was when it was started. Again, I put that double cross file out in chronology, and the building, the isolation of the buildings, the security of the buildings, and the breaking of the ground at Guyana, and that also has to do with security of the other temples too. Then the UCLA school, the information I talked about last week, the Nike bases, and then under that, other sections and intents of that UCLA school, which was to be run in conjunction with LEAA, the law enforcement agencies, and the Defense Department and National Institute of Mental Health. The techniques that the school was to use, 32 are their stated goals, such as studying suicides and violence and active children and prediction of violence and nonviolent people and violence of women, as I said, when they're menstruating. And these are the kinds of tests. The intent of the UCLA school goes in this section. And then under that, the use of the media. Now, the Sam Ervin Committee book on behavior modification in government programs in 74 talks about a media connection, having somebody pronounce the value of this great school and what it's doing, to sell it all the time like you sell soap or tobacco. And in there goes a marvelous article in the Los Angeles Times last week about Mark Lane and the use of the media. So one time I may do just the entire tape, maybe next week, on the media and mind control and Mark Lane, going from Dallas up to Guyana. But with this outline, when you have it, you can refer to it as you get these tapes. Just go back to Section 4, number 33, and we'll talk about Mark Lane and the media. And as I did with my story, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, or the SLA as the CIA, I'll take it way back from the Kennedy assassination up to the present date. And that way you'll be able to see the linear connections. Also at UCLA, they were planning mass fingerprints to study genetics and immunology. And we'll go into the fingerprint plants at UCLA, the fingerprints of Guyana's temple that they're doing in Dover, Delaware now, and the use of fingerprints to study violence and the Howard-Hughes connections. Then the drugs and narcotics that were to be tested at UCLA, the kinds of drugs that were at Jonestown. Education, they were to have people come in at the UCLA Nike bases for conferences to see the products of the brain control, such as when Candy Jones was in the CIA and they had demonstrations and called in people to see how many carrots they could put in her vagina before she'd scream, and they'd all stand around and watch while she was hypnotized. And she wrote about that. This is what you call educational conferences, and Mark Lane said that this was an educational institute from all over the world. It turned out later that these people were illiterate and couldn't even read the Marxist books that were all over the shelves that were left there for them. Most of them were pretty illiterate, that were the zombies that were shipped down there and drugged. We'll go into the education versus the deprivation, and then the electrodes, zombies, robots, hypnotic trances, the reason to believe that various people were in a state of mind control, and then the mental patients in Jones' care before and during, who was allocated or delivered to him. Number 39 under this section 4 is the medical unit, the staff, who was there, how many people operated it, where are they now. Then Dr. Schacht from Houston, he was from Houston, Texas, educated in Mexico, and he was dishing out the Nazi cyanide, a whole section in addition under cast of characters because of the mind control experiments and the kind of operation it was. The Dr. Schacht may or may not be a relative of Hjalmar Schacht, the president of the Reichsbank in Germany that funded Adolf Hitler and then set up the money for Aristotle Onassis to begin his all-German shipping fleet and crew. Onassis had built up the shipyards through Schacht's money in the 50s in Japan and Germany after World War II. This may be a coincidence of names, but even a journalist from Germany had called me yesterday about Dr. Schacht down there. Then the techniques used of mind control, sexual deprivations, perversions, punishments, and experiments of sexual natures, trickery to deceive, the Campbell cure, the crippled cures, and so forth, starvation, favoritism, and control of food, slavery, racism, black labor to build, produce, and white office jobs. Not only the camp was run like a Nazi organization, but everything about it smelled of Nazi Germany, even to the possible extraction of the gold of their teeth. That's why the family should demand to see those bodies. I don't care what state they're in. The gold would be in the teeth if they had their fillings. And I think that they should just prove to us that the gold didn't come from their teeth. I think they owe us that much, just to see what in the hell really went down there. Torture, punishment, drug clinics, beatings, drownings, and so forth. Weapons aimed at resistors, forced to work, and stockpiled to kill. The weapons are to run the concentration camps, and I have it cross-filed in two places, as up above under the contingency plans to murder, and then this is just the physical amount of weapons that were available, photographs of weapons, and how they came in, as against federal agencies, because we're not sure how they came in yet. So it's not under Jim Jones and the Defense Department or Jim Jones and the State Department or alcohol, tobacco, and firearms or organized crime, because we don't know where the weapons came from, but they're there. I put this in section 4 and number 46. And then protection after complaints. When people were objecting to what was going on, what kind of protection did Jim Jones have, who wrote it off in general in the community of San Francisco, and also the protection of the FBI, the State Department, police, and Guyana people who said, don't touch Jim Jones, and the comparison to Charles Manson in the Santa Monica Mountains when the neighbors were complaining about the drugs and the violence and the shootings, and the orders went out, don't touch Charles Manson. So you have protection here of all kinds of agencies. There were also parents complaining or siblings complaining, and they were told, there's nothing wrong. You're sick. You're making it up. Everything is kosher down in Guyana. There's no reason for the federal agents to protect, if it's a socialist country and a Marxist down there, and the FBI has all this information on any type of Marxist socialist activities, and if people like Angela Davis and Charles Gary are calling down there, they certainly would have a record of these so-called Marxists or socialists, unless they're really a front for something more insidious and evil, which is actually what it turned out to be. Section 5, Congressman Leo Ryan and the news media come to break the barriers. Now, they're the first people to break through those walls, to literally say, we are coming, and to be allowed to leave from Georgetown to Jonestown, and they broke the barriers. In Section 1 are the motives and what they'd have to do in case anybody arrived. Section 2 are the contingencies that were made from the beginning in case of a so-called invasion of any authorities that weren't paid off, because they totally controlled the Guyana government. Section 3 is Jim Jones himself, the operation and interrelation between the U.S. government, the CIA, federal and state connections, and then Section 4 is what was happening to that poor mass of humanity, those 910 people down there in the way of food deprivation and sexual harm and overworking labor, slave labor conditions, living like on a slave ship in their little bunks and so forth. That was Section 4. And now comes good Congressman Leo Ryan, the man who gets involved bringing down members of the news media. Congress refuses to move. That's Section 5 under Roman numeral 5, number 49. Members of Congress who refuse to move, we should find out who else was asked to investigate, and the actual arrangements of the trip by Ryan himself, including the correspondence with Mark Lane that preceded it. Then the next section is the actual physical murder of Congressman Ryan and the others, and then Guyana begins to delay their investigation. All the people that helped Jim Jones preceding up to this, if you're following my line of reasoning of how I work and separate the information, up to this point, all those agencies listed in Section 3 helped him. Now, what did they do after the bodies were murdered? And this is an important point, because assuming Jim Jones was just the craziest nut, dumb, leading people off, charismatic, could influence people to think his way, fool them with trickery. Once those lives were gone, assuming they made an honest mistake and the suicide drills weren't taken seriously, assuming nobody really even believed it was going to happen, as soon as one throat was cut of the Amos woman down in Georgetown, her 3 children were killed, as soon as that happened, the American troops should have moved in instantly. But in this Section 5 is part of the contingency plan, the control of the federal government, the Defense Department, the FBI, the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Guyana officials, the local police. Everybody came in to stall the mop-up, to stall it, and it stalled today. And that is the part of the contingency plan, but this is what had to happen after the barriers were broken. First, Guyana delays the investigation. Then the United States Army delays it and waits till the bodies decay. The next section is the refusal of autopsies or identification, even though Guyana had the names of each person immediately and their fingerprints and waited 2 weeks to say that. The planning of the letters to make it a political ploy, the overtones of communism, leftist, Marxist, the library books, the note pinned on the body, the corpse going back that was discovered by the FBI, the patsy, this is the ploy that's used over and over again, the use of Dover, Delaware Army Base, the mass fingerprinting, the links of that to the Defense Department, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, the Charleston, South Carolina, the Army doctor, the resettlement, and the more mysteries in Charleston that have to do with the Army. Then all evidence that is planted, such as the notes found on the body or the Marxist books there, all evidence that is missing or destroyed goes into Section 56 under Roman numeral 5, and then the cremation of Jones, which is also the destruction of evidence. But the autopsy and the cremation of Jones, they said they did an autopsy in Georgetown, then they said they did one in Dover, Delaware, and then a week later they said, I guess we'll do an autopsy on 6 people, including Jim Jones. Roman numeral 6 is the conspiratorial links to the broader work that I have done that pertains to Jim Jones, information coming in now. Always the witnesses that were murdered or threatened or missing, the primary witnesses. The next section is the Hughes Medical Institute in Miami, their new satellite hospital in Boston, their 12 hospitals around the country, their study of genetics and immunology at UCLA in Boston, where their money goes, Stanford and UCLA in California, and also, as I say, their satellite hospitals and the links to mind control and experiments on people. The Boston hospital connections, their known racism, the use of Dr. Mark Irvin and Dr. Sweet, and their links to UCLA, and then back to Boston and Dr. Delgado. Those are the Boston connections. Then under 61, Dr. Jolly West and the team from Boston that came out to his institute at UCLA, and Nazi connections, Nazi doctors that wanted to do psychosurgery, the CIA funding the federal defense funds, and the Boston team. Under 62 is all the racism and hatred of the blacks, Jim Jones, and the federal agencies. I could have put that under the Section 3, the biography of Jim Jones, but that mostly is his political clout, his financing, and his know-how. This is the broad international Nazi links, the racism, the hatred of blacks. There's a quotation in the paper this week that he did this because he wanted to see how many blacks he could kill at one time, and out of the 910, we still don't have a breakdown of age or of color, which is terribly important that we have to find out. But that's an international problem. This Nazism is an international. It isn't a Jim Jones problem, or he wouldn't have all this money and weapons and clout that he has. So the racism goes under the conspiratorial links, and then the links of Jim Jones and the operation to the SLA, the Zodiac killings, the Zebra killings, the Manson operation with their CIA, FBI violences, the similarities in the cases, and also the parallels and some of the same people in common. Dr. Jolly West was Jack Ruby's psychiatrist. He was the doctor at UCLA, admittedly by the CIA, later to be part of their team, recipient of Howard Hughes medical money. He's a psychiatrist that's been with Patty Hearst. His name runs through this, and Mark Lane's name, of course, runs through the whole era. The word white knight, a symbol of international racism. It could mean kill a top. It could mean kill a president, Jimmy Carter, the white knight, kill the mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone. White knight was the code word, allegedly, for kill all the blacks. But the only reason they had to kill all the blacks was so that the persons who would be out doing the white knight job, like the International White Guard or the Klans, the operators would be recognized, and the blacks were only a cover for a major operation that was going on down there, a worldwide, international, with banks in Zurich and Panama and other places. And then the churches, of course, Jim Jones was a church. The missionary down in Oaxaca, Mexico, where the assassins were trained, was a church cover. The World Council of Churches, the links of Jim Jones to the various church organizations, the way he was ordained, in quotes, ordained his membership, members of the Greek Orthodox Church, such as that Mr. Katsaris, who also takes care of mentally disturbed children, a psychologist, and the links of the CIA to the church organizations. I say CIA here, but it also is the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. Albert Osborne, the man that accompanied Lee Harvey Oswald on the bus from Texas down to Mexico, was supposed to be a minister, a member of the church, who ran the missionary, wore the collar, the cloak of a churchman, actually had multiple passports in England and the United States, and was a member of the Defense Industry Security Command. The church, as a cover for assassination teams, is very good because, as I said before, nobody can come in and break in and expose them because of freedom of religion. It's a hands-off policy, and even people in the neighborhood stay away if there's a church cult and don't interfere with them. Then the Mexican connections, always with the CIA. We do have Mexican connections. It's another part of the United States. It's right down there, set up as an adjunct or part of the CIA. Right now, in this case, the only Mexican connection is that Dr. Schock went to Mexico to medical school. But I have a section here because I feel that there will be information either on the drugs or the weapons or the church that moved from Oaxaca, that Mexico will always be filled up with some information it has in every other one of the conspiracies I've studied. Then the comparison of the Jones operation to Nazi concentration camps. Not only the techniques that I've listed under the mind control programs of the slave labor and the beatings and humiliations and deprivations, starvation and so forth, the general intent, the quotations, once there no way out, or he tells a woman, drug this person in San Francisco and then ship them to me. The comparisons to an order, the people were treated like garbage. They were humanity that were a cover for something different. Now, Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka were used to eliminate the entire Jewish race. This was the final solution. But they were also used as slave labor to grow and maintain not only the premises, work in the chemical factories to make synthetic tires until they died, or to pull out the rocks And the mines, they were, in this case, they grew food for the white coterie around them while they were being deprived. And there are many similarities. In Germany concentration camps, I don't think they even grew food. They didn't eat. They just kept them and burned them and let them be shot, different ways of getting rid of them, gassed and so forth. But in this case, they grew the food so that the others, who were either in narcotics traffic or gun running and training assassination teams, were sure to survive because the slave labor grew the food for them and they couldn't eat it themselves. And then under 68A, I already have an A there, and as I say, this will get larger and larger, are the connections in the conspiratorial links to Dr. Joseph Delgado from Yale University. It will be cross-filed under several sections above, but his use of monkeys and mind control, because Jim Jones raised monkeys, similar to the kind that Dr. Delgado has been experimenting on for years, and also because UCLA school was to use these monkeys at the same time, and I'll want to keep a record of just the animals there. Were they seen there at the time of the killings? There were dead animals found. I don't know if any monkeys were found, but that was part of the plan at UCLA, and definitely the working of Dr. Delgado for the past 20 years or more. There's no room on this paper, but I'll continue later. Section 7 are the murders of connecting links to Jim Jones. Mayor George Moscone was first on the list, and that next section goes into the politics of San Francisco, the mafia, organized crime connections, and Intertel, the conflict of taking over the city now, and the man who shot George Moscone rented property from Pier 39 that is allegedly owned by Intertel. The politics of San Francisco that mingles to Jonestown will follow under Roman numeral section 7. But now you have this outline, and when I go into detail on one or more sections of it, you can know where it fits into my frame of thinking, and I think we can all work on this story together by sharing this information from the start and then putting the more specific details into these various categories. Next week I'll do more on Mark Lane, the common denominator from Kennedy assassination up to Guyana Gate. Take care. I'll see you next week.